Hi everyone, we're going to make a start. It's 4 o'clock. Firstly, thank you to each of you for coming along today. This seminar is being hosted by the Australasian Agricultural and Resource Economics Society branch here in South Australia. If you have any questions about our group, you can ask me afterwards or we can get in touch via email. And today I'm really pleased that Dr. Michelle Lim from the Adelaide Law School has agreed to come and talk with us. A brief bio about Michelle. Dr. Michelle Lim is a transdisciplinary environmental law scholar and a lecturer in the Adelaide Law School. Michelle's work on environmental law and governance occurs at the intersection between biodiversity and human wellbeing. Michelle was a 2016-17 Law Council of Australia Young Environmental Lawyer of the Year, and she was a fellow and an author of the IPBES Global Assessment, and that's the topic of her talk today. So we'll have about an hour all up with some time at the end for some questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki, and this is the title of what I'm going to be talking about today. I know not everybody is fluent in emoji, but essentially what does unprecedented global biodiversity decline mean for the economy, agriculture and human well-being? But before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that we meet on the unceded land of the Kaurna people. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and thank our Indigenous peoples around the world for their continuing custodian relationship to the land and the contributions to our cities and our communities. So I'd like to start with a public service announcement. Beep, 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 beep. The patient's heart rate flatlines. This is a medical emergency. Lights flash above the patient's door and across the hospital you can hear on the intercom, medical emergency, code blue, medical emergency, code blue team respond. If you are on the code blue team, you are running down the corridor because you know that you have seconds to spare, and every second can mean more of a chance to save a life. When you are with the patient, you've got a really diverse team of people working to save this life, a team of physicians, nurses, doctors, sometimes even a minister. You've got people at different stages of their career. Maybe they hate each other, but they are all collaborating, and it doesn't matter how junior the person is on the team, what discipline within this profession they might be coming from. If you have a good idea, it's that good idea that's going to be run with, all in order to save a life. So today, our patient is the planet, and we are Team Code Blue. So our discussion today is essentially about looking at the vital signs of our planet, as all good practitioners would do. Many of you might be aware of the planetary boundaries concept, the work by Will Steffen and others, which, if you look at the health report card of the planet as a whole, you will see that across a range of planetary boundaries, we are transgressing beyond the capacity of our planet to maintain a safe operating space for humanity. Climate change gets a lot of attention, and it should, but there are also a range of other ecological systems that are under severe threat. This includes fresh water, ocean acidification, land system change, but the two most critical of these boundaries are those of biosphere integrity, which essentially means biodiversity, and climate change. So it's these two boundaries, transgression of which will have the most severe effect on the range of other boundaries. And it is on the biodiversity, biosphere integrity boundary that we focus on today, looking at the health report specifically of biodiversity, and that's where we're looking at the IPBES Global Assessment, which talks about the state of biodiversity and its contributions to people. So today we are going to be asking the question, what is IPBES? What did the Global Assessment find? And in conclusion, how do we transform our legal governance and economic systems? And I really do mean we, as in number one, we as a species. So what did the global assessment find in terms of things that we can do as a global community to address the biodiversity crisis? Number two, what can we do as individuals to address unprecedented global biodiversity loss? And importantly, in an audience that I often don't get to speak a lot to, what can we do as a transdisciplinary community of scholars to address this huge challenge that we're facing at a planetary level? So I'll start by addressing the question, what is IPBES? Now, when I tell you what the acronym stands for, you'll go, yeah, that's why we need an acronym. So it stands for the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Intergovernmental because it's not just about scientists, academia doing our thing, it's about engaging governments. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Science policy, same thing about making policy relevant, creating policy relevant advice through the assessments, and Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services explains what the assessments, what this collection of knowledge is about. So when the global assessment came out, many of you might have heard in the media the fact that this UN report had found a range of things about biodiversity. It's actually not a UN report. It's a UN-backed report, of course, and that's where some of the differences with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is. It's actually an independent panel of 134 countries, and even though it's supported by a range of UN organs, it isn't actually a UN report. So it does have that benefit going for it in that it is connected to, but independent from the UN system. And importantly, assessments respond to the needs of governments. So one of the key tasks of IPBES is to provide policy-relevant advice based on the best available science. So often you might hear about IPBES referred to as the IPCC for biodiversity. It performs a very similar function to the IPCC, but as we will discuss, it took 7 years to negotiate IPBES, and it looked at the experience of IPCC, then recognised that biodiversity has its own particular issues which require a more inclusive intergovernmental process. So we'll talk about that in a sec. So the key thing that IPBES does is assessments. So the global assessment is one of them, but there's also assessments at a range of different levels, including at the regional level and also on thematic areas such as pollination, values, etc., etc. So what assessments are is the collection of knowledge through systematic review to provide decision makers with the knowledge required based on, in many ways, all of the science, and we'll talk about what I mean by all of the science in a little bit, based on the scientific evidence across a range of different publications. So it's different from just having one study. It's a collection of studies. And providing policy support, so supporting governments to take up the knowledge from the assessments. And this is where IPBES builds on the IPCC. It has this capacity building function, which helps governments take up the knowledge of the assessments, which wasn't such a huge function of IPCC. And there's also a communications and outreach function, which is so important that we take scientific knowledge, academic knowledge, and communicate that in a way that governments can understand, but also citizens can understand. So the authors of the assessment go off and write the assessment, but what do we mean by it being an intergovernmental process? So the most recent plenary was held in Paris at the end of April, where you have governments from the 134 member states who are on the plenary, who are at the plenary and actually discuss the findings of the assessment with the authors of the assessment. Now, you might ask the question, does that mean that the findings of the scientific findings, are they jeopardized? Does that mean it's politicizing science? And that would be a really good question. The reason I say that is because I thought the same thing. So what I actually found, but when being part of the plenary, it isn't the case of governments pushing the answers, pushing the framing of the scientific outcomes. It is very much a dialogue between the authors of the report and the governments. And I found that the whole process was very much one of government representatives saying, I don't understand how you phrase this. I can't bring this back to my governments because they won't understand what this means. Can you put it in language that my governments can understand better? So it's more those sorts of discussions which are facilitated by the fact that the governments themselves form very much a role of gatekeepers in terms of not allowing other interests to be, the scientific facts to be altered by political interests because they're kind of keeping checks on each other in a sense. So also at the plenary you've got a range of observers, and this is where the UN comes in. You've got the range of conventions who are also observers, potential members, and other accredited bodies. What's also important is the emphasis of including stakeholders. So stakeholders are a key part of the IPBES process. So you've got a range of views that are coming into the process, which is different to how the IPCC was structured. So a key part of ensuring that a range of knowledge holders in terms of biodiversity are included in this process. You've got the Bureau, a multidisciplinary expert panel, which is, again, an important part of how the IPBES process works from the very beginning. Emphasis on the idea that it's not just your ecological sciences that are important, a range of different knowledge systems, a range of different disciplines are incorporated here. You've got expert groups and task force, and also a shout out to the Secretariat, who are this incredible bunch of people who are employed full-time, but actually work much more than full-time to actually make the assessments work. So apart from the Secretariat that's based in Bonn, you've also got technical support units that are based around the world. So again, facilitating a range of worldviews and a range of different perspectives from around the world to be incorporated into the final assessment. So why are IPBES assessments important? Why is the global assessment significant? So I would say for two reasons. Number one, the conceptual advances that have come out of the IPBES assessment, and we'll talk about that in a sec. And number two, the rigorous process by which a range of different types of knowledge have been included in this assessment. So in terms of conceptual innovation, the IPBES conceptual framework aims to integrate thinking across not just the physical sciences, but also the social sciences, the range of worldviews, recognizing that it's a range of complex systems that are interacting to influence how we engage with nature in a range of different ways. Part of the IPBES conceptual framework is the advancement of ecosystem services. So the IPBES framework builds on ecosystem services, but recognises that there are a wide range of ways in which we engage with nature that the term services itself doesn't entirely encompass. So it's an evolution from this idea of nature providing services to us, a shift to recognizing that it's nature's contributions and that those contributions are co-produced by humans and nature. So to give an example, if you think about a eucalyptus tree, you might value that tree because you planted it with your parents, and so it has that sort of existence value. You might value the tree because of the shade it provides for your house. And what nature's contribution to people also recognizes is that not all of the contributions of nature to humans are necessarily ones that we find positive. So that same eucalyptus tree could be a risk of when the branches then fall on your house. So what it's attempting to do is to recognize that for the same part of nature, there could be a range of different ways in which even the same people find benefits or disbenefits. And importantly, nature's contributions to people recognises the fact that Indigenous worldviews and Indigenous and local knowledge are key to recognising our human and environment relationships. So perhaps a few hundred years too late, but hopefully not too late overall, this idea that we need to acknowledge the importance of Indigenous worldviews and how those understandings can help us protect biodiversity and nature into the future. So as we've talked about already, NCP extends ecosystem services to say ecosystem services are really good in terms of providing monetary valuation of nature, but it's more than that. Nature is important to us beyond what we can put a dollar value on, and using a range of different worldviews to help us understand this, and therefore, as the authors contend, nature's contribution to people is likely to shape better governance instruments and more effective instruments. Another conceptual innovation that is integrated within the global assessment is that of telecoupling. So we spoke before about how ecological systems and social systems are inextricably linked. So we know that, but what telecoupling says is not only are socio-ecological systems closely linked, but that they're also linked across space and time. So this is really important, I would imagine, to this audience, given that our agricultural systems are impacted by things that happen in different parts around the world, and therefore some of the drivers of biodiversity loss, again, are no longer are we looking at just local issues, it's more global issues that extend across the globe and also incorporate public and private actors, and so too are those policy decisions that are taken perhaps many kilometres away, even in a different continent, but thinking about how those impacts play out in the local context. So telecoupling wasn't invented by the global assessment, but what we did have was one of the key authors, the key instigators of telecoupling worldwide, Liu Jianguo at Michigan State University. He was one of the key leading authors of the report, and so this concept of telecoupling was taken through the assessment. So to give an example of this, which comes out of Liu's paper in Science, this idea that actions that happen in one part of the globe can have significant impacts, which then impact other countries which are very far away. So the example here is deforestation in Brazil is driven by a need for soybean, both for human and domestic animal use in China. On top of that, the interactions between Brazil and China impacting global food systems. And then you've got dust storms in the Sahara Desert, which in some ways are driven by agricultural practices there, which then affect the coral systems in the Caribbean, also contributing to issues such as asthma in the Caribbean, which then in turn come back to impact on China and Brazil, who rely really heavily on tourism, infrastructure, etc., and invest quite heavily in tourism and infrastructure in the Caribbean. So you're seeing that actions that occur in one country have impacts across the rest of the globe, and therefore highlighting the complexities and difficulties of dealing with global biodiversity loss. So those are the conceptual innovations of the IPBES conceptual framework. What I will now talk about is how the assessment process works. So I might spend a little bit of time talking about systematic review. Some of you might be really familiar with systematic review, but as a lawyer, it was a really steep learning curve, because I went to the process going, systematic review? I've got a system. How about Google Scholar? That's all right, isn't it? But what systematic review, for many of you would be really familiar with, it requires this process, this agreed methodological process of reviewing a range of literature. Even the databases you use need to be agreed. And what I didn't know is that Google Scholar actually gives you results based on your previous searches, and therefore can jeopardize your systematic review because you're not doing a random broader search of the literature that you probably should under systematic review. So the whole process of the assessment involved extensive systematic review. At the end of the day, there were more than 15,000 publications, both grey literature and academic literature, that was looked at over a 3-year process. In total, 500 experts were involved. 145 experts worked on it throughout the whole 3 years. I was one of the 16 fellows, but we also got on board contributing authors to deal with specific topics within the assessment where there wasn't that expertise within the assessment itself. And more than 50 countries were involved. So not only was there this really broad overview of the literature, the process itself was also a very rigorous process. So a range of draft documents were produced, and each of those drafts were then open for comment. And authors responded meticulously to each of those comments. So a very robust process and a very rigorous process as well. So that's one of the reasons why the findings are significant, also because of the conceptual innovation. And 3, what the IPBES assessment also included was scenarios and models. So this is an extension of the previous large global assessment, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. So you actually have projections of what the future would look like if we take particular actions on biodiversity. So it's not just opinions, but actual projections on what the future might look like, and a whole chapter dedicated to looking at policy options and reviewing existing governance structures and legal systems, etc. So that's a chapter I was involved in. So I know what you might be thinking. Okay, yes, it's a good process, you're very rigorous, etc., but why keep us in suspense? What did the assessment actually find? Found a lot of things, as you would expect. But if you were to drill it down to 3 things, it would be this. Number 1, that nature is fundamentally important, not only for its existence value, but also because of its contributions it makes to humanity. Number 2, we are losing biodiversity and these contributions at rates never before seen across human history. We're not yet at the mass extinction, but we're getting close. Yes, we can do something about it. And the one of the key findings of the assessment is that we can do something about this. But we need to act now, and we need to do so in revolutionary ways in which we transform our economic and governance and legal systems. So I'll add a little bit more to each of these key findings as we go through, starting with how biodiversity underpins human well-being. I suspect for many of us, this idea that we have nature, we have biodiversity in itself is so important. That in itself is reason why we need to act immediately to prevent biodiversity loss. But the more utilitarian among us might also like to know that biodiversity is essential for food, fuel, medicine, physical and mental health, genetic resources, sustaining our culture, and also the ecological processes that biodiversity contributes to, helps deal with pollution, regulates our climate, important for our soil, fresh water, etc., etc. Pollination, another key contribution of biodiversity to human well-being, and also a very important function for pest control and also in terms of natural disasters. So my postdoc was looking at ecosystem services and poverty alleviation in Bangladesh. And Bangladesh has the unwanted accolade of being the most disaster-prone area in the world. So very frequent and serious cyclones, but when Cyclone Aila hit the coast of Bangladesh, where there were mangroves, the destruction was far less than even in areas where there were big dikes, etc., etc. Which brings me to my next point. And are there any Beyonce fans in the house? Excellent. Because, and I'm paraphrasing the global assessment here, the assessment found that many of the contributions that biodiversity makes to human well-being, unlike the bloke who Beyonce was talking about in the song, are irreplaceable. We can't get a box and go to the left, and put our bundles of what nature's contributions into a box to the left, because they are irreplaceable. We can't humanly make the range of benefits that nature provides to us. So we know that biodiversity is important. It's something that we know inherently, but if you wanted the science to support what you inherently know, biodiversity is so important, but it's in a pretty bad state. Never before in human history, so in no time in the last 10 million years, have we seen the rates of extinction that we are currently experiencing. So they're 10 to 100 times background rates. 75% of the land surface has been modified by human activity, 66% of the ocean significantly modified. We've lost 80% of wetland cover and 50% of coral cover, and if nothing changes, in the next few decades, we're looking at losing 1 million species. That's not individual plants or animals, but 1 million species could go extinct. Now, this also has important implications for global food security already. We are seeing how reduced species and genetic diversity are reducing the capacity of agricultural systems to respond to global change. Impacts such as climate change, land degradation has already resulted in a reduction of 23% of the global land area. Pollinator loss, if you want to put a dollar value on something, it's costing annually, every year, $235 to $577 billion. And we also talked about how when you have diminished coastal habitats, you're also losing the capacity to respond to natural disasters. So what's causing all of this? Well, there's what the assessment has called direct drivers and indirect drivers. Let's have a think. There are 5 direct drivers. What do we think are the 5 direct causes of biodiversity loss? Yes, population growth is one of it, more so as an indirect driver. They classified that as an indirect driver, and we will get to that. And it's pushing a lot of these direct drivers. What else?
Loss of habitat.
Yes. Land use change is the number 1 cause of biodiversity loss on land, not in the oceans. What do we think might be the key cause? Well, also loss of habitat, but not land use change as much in the oceans. What's this? Would be the main driver of biodiversity loss in the oceans. Climate change, number 3. Getting more and more serious, but definitely climate change, very important, but only number 3 at the moment. At the moment. Good. So in the oceans, it's direct exploitation of species, that exact phrase, which is causing the loss of species in the oceans. And we'll talk through each of these. Land use change is the key driver of biodiversity loss on land, primarily through large-scale agricultural expansion. So to put a number on it, 1/3 of terrestrial land has been converted for farming for either crops or domestic animals. And at the same time, population growth feeds into it, but since 1992, not that long ago, I was even alive then, since 1992, you have had a doubling of the urban population. So key changes in land use change contributing to habitat loss. As a result, you're losing your grasslands, forests, wetlands, etc., to make room for this land use change. And in the oceans, but number 2 on land, is the direct exploitation of species. So logging, fishing, hunting. The second most important cause of biodiversity loss on land, the most important loss of biodiversity in the oceans. The next 3, and it is in order in terms of the impact of each of these activities, the next 3 into the future are going to become increasingly important. And of course, climate change. So the assessment underlines a fact that has already been highlighted by the IPCC, that climate change is already, it's going to be much, much worse into the future, but it's already having significant impacts on our natural systems. Some habitats are particularly vulnerable, in particular corals. So if we think about the Paris Agreement, widely thought to be a success of international collaboration, the Paris Agreement is getting, under current projections, nowhere near 1.5 degrees warming. We're looking more like 3 or 4 degrees. That doesn't sound like a lot, just 1 or 2 degrees. What does it mean for corals? 1.5 degrees, and we've already lost 70 to 90% of our corals. 2 degrees virtually wipes out all the corals in the world. It's that serious. So when our Prime Minister brings coal into Parliament and says that is the future, I'm not sure he necessarily has a full grasp on the implications of climate change for our natural systems, but also of how we live sustainable and enjoyable lives on these planets, on our planet. The 2 other key drivers of biodiversity loss, pollution, and this is also linked very closely to land use change. So pollution in the form of greenhouse gas emissions is one of them, but also in terms of urban and rural waste, runoff from agriculture, and also from mining and other processes. Invasive species, well, we're in Australia, so I don't really need to go into too much detail of the important impacts that invasive species have not only on the natural environment, but also its costs to human well-being and to our economies. And this is underpinned by indirect drivers, which we started talking about earlier, which stem from values and behaviours of human society. And the key indirect drivers include unsustainable consumption and production, population growth, trade, technology, but also how we structure our governance systems and how we implement them. So, looking to the future, can we fix this problem? Yes, we can, but we need to change how we've been interacting with our natural world. What if we don't implement transformative change? We're stuffed. Well, the assessment didn't exactly use that wording, but the projections indicate that we will not meet a range of global societal and environmental goals. By specifically, they mean the Sustainable Development Goals, and these are not just environmental goals that we will fail to meet, but also a range of goals in relation to human well-being. So goals around health, goals around the economy will be jeopardised if we do not protect the environmental base, which a range of ways in which we define a good quality of life. If we do not protect the environmental base in which each of these stems from, we're not going to have a good quality of life anyhow. The Aichi targets are going to be reviewed next year. I don't think it's a surprise to many of you that a large percentage of the Aichi targets will not be met. Some will be, those in terms of protected areas, and also a range of the targets under the Paris Agreement won't be met. And the assessment also found that when they reviewed targets under 6 of the biodiversity-related multilateral environmental agreements, many of these are not on track to be met. So, yes, existing laws and governance systems have gone some way to address the biodiversity crisis, but it's not enough. We need to act in more transformative ways. And an interesting point, and I'll explain why I say interesting in a bit, an interesting point that came out of the assessment is this recognition that if we are going to implement transformative change, we're going to expect opposition from the status quo. And I say interesting because governments actually signed off on this to recognise the fact that we are dealing with a range of vested interests when attempting to implement transformative change, but a very hopeful message also comes out at the same time. We can, and this is supported by evidence, not just opinion, that we can overcome this transformative change for the broader good. But what do we need to do? How do we transform our legal and governance systems? I'll start by talking about what we can do as a species, and this is essentially the findings that come out of the assessment itself. I'll then talk about what we can do individually, so that is not directly what's come out of the assessment, but through some of the thinking I've done around the assessment itself, then thinking about what that means for us as individuals, and finally, what can we as an academic community do to address this loss of the natural world. So one of the key findings that comes out of the assessment is the need to shift our current worldviews. And this includes recognising and incorporating Indigenous science and Indigenous governance systems, elevating the importance of placing humans not at the centre of the system, but as part of this interconnected system. And from that, this idea that we shift the economic model to build a global sustainable economy, and to do that, we can do that through a mix of policy tools, including incentive programs and certification, etc. Internationally consistent taxation, which is supported by the multilateral environmental agreements. The assessment also highlighted the fact that we need to move beyond GDP. This idea that GDP is an indicator or a proxy for environmental well-being has from the very beginning been debunked, because it was never meant to be an indicator of how much of a good quality of life one has, but has since been adopted as that indicator. So shifting beyond GDP as an indicator of how well a country is doing. Nature-based solutions is something else that came out of the report, including urban solutions, so green roofs, fresh water systems, etc. And the assessment also recognises the challenge we have of linking international collaboration with action at the local level. So the difficulties, but the importance of linking up international cooperation and how we integrate those systems to apply globally agreed standards to locally relevant measures. The assessment also highlighted 5 key interventions. These include incentives and capacity building. They highlighted the fact that incentives do work. The issue that we have for biodiversity is often it's perverse incentives that work in a way which is detrimental to biodiversity. They also highlighted the importance of collaborating across sectors. So still, we have government departments which has the environment separated from the range of other sectors. The assessment emphasised the need for collaboration across a range of sectors and the mainstreaming of biodiversity. The precautionary principle, preemptive action, that came up again, and decision-making in the context of resilience and uncertainty is very important, because we are faced with global environmental change where we don't know what the future will be like, because we have altered our ecological systems in such a manner that they no longer function in the way that we're used to them functioning. So we're likely to see a lot of abrupt shifts and a range of surprise. So the assessment suggests the importance of looking at a range of plausible future states and implementing decision-making systems which are robust under a range of different scenarios. Environmental law, I'm glad, is also highlighted as being important, but the assessment's also saying we need to do it differently, we need stronger implementation, so it's not just law that's emphasised, but rule of law as well, the importance of robust governance systems that support environmental law. Now that sounds quite broad level. Let's take it down to a bit more of a personal level. What can you do as an individual to stem the loss of biodiversity? So the report talks about decision makers. Within that, it's encompassed the fact that as consumers, as citizens, we are decision makers as well. So as individuals, we do have an important role to play. And not just for NIDOC week, but across every week, the importance of, particularly in Australia, embracing and recognising the importance of Indigenous knowledge and also Indigenous law and Indigenous governance systems. Also, as a consumer, thinking about what we consume, how much we consume, what we do once we've finished consuming, how we use less, how we even also, there was a section that looked at food as an important way in which we can contribute to, one, at the very minimum, not extending the biodiversity crisis, but addressing it as well, thinking about more sustainable and healthier diets. And yes, there was the suggestion, my apologies to meat eaters, sorry, not sorry, I do eat meat myself, do I need to make the disclosure that yes, eating a bit less meat, you don't have to cut it out entirely, but it would help by eating a bit less meat. The third point, which I think is important, because it feels like sometimes governments and corporations like to say, well, if you as individuals just go and do the right thing, then we'll be fine. We don't need to do anything. But I think it's so important that we collaborate, that we join together to hold governments and corporations accountable. Yes, we can do so much as individuals, but we can do more by pressuring those who have the power to make much broader scale changes, to engage in transformative change. And number 4, I don't want it to feel like biodiversity, doing something for biodiversity is such hard work. Number 4 is about connecting with nature. Even if it means just going outside and having a look at the ironbark, spending a few moments looking at the dark of the trunk contrasted against the beautiful aqua green and the pink along the trees, along the leaves, looking at the flowers. That moment to connect with nature is backed by science as being good for our health, but it also helps us engage with what it is we're looking at our end goal of ensuring that the natural world isn't no longer natural. So go for a walk, don't feel bad about it. If you've got heaps of marking, maybe if there's ants walking across your desk, that might be enough to observe the process of nature. Bring a little bit of nature into your lives and you'll feel better for it. Now, my next point is about how we collaborate. What can we do as an academic community? So you might not be surprised if, again, I would like to highlight the importance of engaging with Indigenous governance and knowledge systems. I've had the benefit of working in the Kimberley and seeing how much existing Indigenous knowledge has to contribute. So, for example, I'm working with an amazing traditional owner, Dr. Anne Paulina, and she's brought a lot of different scientists into the community, and this includes people who are looking at the geology of the land. And some of the things they've found is that there's these ancient water systems that go across the Kimberley. So once Anne was presented with this knowledge, she brought it to the elders, whose reaction was, yeah, we know that. We've got that in the songlines. So this importance of how Indigenous peoples around the world, and the assessment did find, in areas that are protected by Indigenous and local communities, the loss of biodiversity has been significantly less than in other areas. But the assessment also emphasised the fact that the land rights of Indigenous owners and traditional custodians is being constantly eroded across a range of jurisdictions. Secondly, engage with decision makers. This is one of the key aims of the IPBES report, and it's so important that our work as an academic community gets out to who has the power to make a difference, beyond us individually, of course. And it's on that note that I would like to talk about, very quickly, some of the research I'm doing with the South Australian government because we have this opportunity where there's been a parliamentary inquiry into biodiversity, which finds that we need to modernise our our environment-related systems. This comes out at a similar time to when the Global Assessment has come out. So working with some excellent people within the Department of Environment on working to bring in some of the findings of the report into South Australian biodiversity law, but also, nothing to do with me, what's already ongoing within Parliament is the Green Adelaide Bill, which is looking at things such as biodiversity sensitive design within urban areas. So there is a lot of hope that we can engage decision makers so that our legal systems work in a way that are providing benefits to nature and by extension to the human communities. As an academic community, I think there's so much we can do within our own disciplines as well. I'll talk about law because that's where I work. For example, you've got climate change litigation based on negligence. Similar things could be done for biodiversity. If we look at corporations law, we don't have it in Australia, but in the UK, the company law in the UK requires that a director acting in the best interest of the company needs to take into account not only society, but also the environment. So there's a range of measures within our own disciplines in which we can create modern and sustainable changes to enhance this transformative change, to create the transformative change required. But finally, and importantly, in a message to our diverse audience here, the assessment emphasises the importance of cross-sectoral collaboration, but within the academic community, something that's really been emphasised and highlighted by the report is how we engage with each other, moving outside our comfort zone, hence the lawyer talking to economists, move outside our comfort zones to engage in transdisciplinary ways, moving our thinking beyond what we could do if we stay within our disciplinary silos. And on that note, I'd like to end with this message. This is our planet, our beautiful, unique, but fragile home. This is our planet and she is calling to us. In the words of the elders, she is saying, come together right now over me. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. It's 5 minutes to 5, so we have some time for questions. Just letting you know, this is being recorded, so if you ask a question, Michelle will repeat it just so it goes through her microphone and people that watch the recording are aware of it. So I'll open it to the floor for questions. Yes, Paul.
When you look at population size of species and you look at giant pandas, the population size giant pandas in the southern hemisphere is 2. I would posit that is actually 2 more than the optimum population size, which is my backward way of saying when we're sitting on the back of such, in our back door we've got so much marsupial extinction, for example. Why do we tolerate this sort of expenditure? The politicians of all stripes go gaga when the 2 pandas get amorous. Isn't it time that we actually tell people that to invest our limited resources in flora and fauna that are important and not cute?
So I'll paraphrase that question which has a local context in terms of why have we chosen 2 individual pandas who are based at the Adelaide Zoo, whose names are Wang Wang and what's the other one called? And everyone knows their name. How do we make these conservation decisions? Why are we focusing on species from beyond where they are traditionally found and focusing instead and not putting that funding instead into conserving our native species, which are under severe threat? Australia has a horrible record as being one of the, if not the most, the greatest extinction rate in the world. And my response to that is, one, I'll take that as a comment, but why not do both? So one of the things that came out of the assessment, and I don't know what the findings were in terms of the effectiveness of zoos, etc., etc. One of the things that came out of the assessment is there needs to be far more resources put into the conservation of biodiversity. And if that was the case, we could do both. We can inspire, and as the example in the room is, we can inspire the awe around flagship species such as pandas and inspire this relationship with the natural world through pandas. But in terms of whether that was a good use of money, I think it would be a different discussion if there was a bigger pot of money that we could do all of that. I know that doesn't directly address your question, but I do very much take that comment on board.
Yeah, my question, I guess, gets to the issue of communication and outreach. I mean, I suspect that there's a fairly big disconnect between what the general public understands about biodiversity and the sort of scientific work that has been done to promote biodiversity. And I guess my question is it useful to focus on an issue that the public can relate to? And I'm thinking of pollination, for example, because pollination is extremely important for our food supply.
Yeah.
And it's something that I think quite a few people can relate to, perhaps not as well as pandas and orangutans and white rhinos, but still, I mean, most people understand bees and their role in pollination and in home gardens and that sort of thing. So is that can you build a campaign around that, an issue like that?
To paraphrase, the question was, what's our best tools for engaging the community? And it's very interesting that and important that you raised the issue of pollination. The pollination assessment, which was the first assessment that came out of IPBES, was embraced by the UK Parliament because they had a couple of members of Parliament who were actually beekeepers. So being able to link to particular decision makers is finding the right people is quite important. But also your point about messaging. I think the global assessment has very much taken that on board, still emphasising the fact that if we do not conserve biodiversity, if you don't care about biodiversity, if you care about human well-being, that is currently being severely undermined, and even more so into the future. But yes, a really important point about what's the best way in which we engage broader publics, because we have a responsibility to do so. So people need to know that it is a planetary emergency that we're dealing with. But yes, a question of what's the best way to do that. Thanks.
We have time for one more question. First hand up was down here.
I'm interested in the politics. You mentioned 134 countries and then other countries involved also in the final report. Are there any significant countries that are not part of participating into this or even resisting the process, or any other major actors that are resisting this process?
So, Australia. Oh, sorry, yes. The question was about the politics and whether there are countries that are opposing the process. Australia, technically, a member. At the recent Paris plenary, we do start with a capital A, right down the front. Australia, 2 spaces. The whole time I was there, Perhaps when I went out for a bathroom break, they might have gone in. The whole time I was there, no one sitting in front of Australia. Disappointing, embarrassing, difficult. But what I did find interesting was the extent to which the US and China did engage with this process. So even under a Trump administration, and I've got a friend who's working within the US department that was involved with this, even under US Trump administration, really positive and collaborative role that's being played by the US. I think because Trump has realised that biodiversity is a thing at the moment. They did have something important to, well, they did block a lot of the framing, have a lot to say about the framing around gender, which seemed to be the one thing that the US was worried about. But China was concerned about how issues around Indigenous people were framed, but it did feel very much like a collaborative process of how do we get the information from the scientists out into the government so we can make decisions for the future and for the present. In terms of a lot of blocking, it doesn't seem to be as politicised as the IPCC, and people who have been involved in both processes commented on how it seems a lot more of a collegial process in IPBES, and hopefully that doesn't change.
Okay, I'll wrap it up there because we are after 5 o'clock. Thank you very much, Michelle, for coming and presenting to our audience, and thank you for all for coming.